Let's take a look at the role controllers play in AngularJS applications, and what we'll end up doing is refactoring some of the code that was in the view previously in other modules of the course, and we're going to move that into controllers, and then as we move along to factories and other things, we'll even refactor that code more. But controllers are really a critical piece of AngularJS, and you'll spend quite a bit of time here. You can think of them as the brain for your view. They define properties and methods, so the properties typically will go on something called the scope, and then methods might handle click type of operations or mouse enter, mouse leave type of operations. They can also work with data retrieval. You can either put that data retrieval in the controller, or you can rely on some other components of Angular that we'll cover later, such as factories or services. And one of the key pieces we'll talk about, it's a very key piece, really the view model, if you will, based on the architecture we talked about earlier, is the scope. Now, the role of scope is to really act as the glue between a controller and a view. The controller is the brain, and it can do some business logic, it can get data from different sources and things like that, but it has to store that data somewhere. Well, you could store the data just right in the controller, but what we're going to do is have an intermediary, or a middleman you could say, which is going to be the scope. So this $scope is actually a key word that AngularJS understands out of the box. In fact, you don't want to call it something else. You'll see as we go through some of the demonstrations coming up. But what it does is automatically handle the view model type of capabilities. In other words, it provides the data specific to what the view is going to render using some of the directives that we talked about earlier. So the view is actually going to bind into the scope's properties. And so if you had, for instance, an array, then an ng repeat could bind to the scope's property, let's say it's called customers, and then iterate through those customers. Now up to this point, we've been putting that data right in the view using ng and init, and that's just because we hadn't covered scope and controllers yet, but now we've kind of graduated up to the controller level, and we're going to see how to refactor that. Now here's an example of how we could create a simple controller to help get started. Now we're going to do a little more than this as we move along, but this is a really good way to get started with controllers in AngularJS. So in this one we have simple controller, and you'll notice it's just a function. And really, controllers can be just boiled down to objects, and functions in JavaScript are objects. So we have simple controller, and you'll notice that scope is a parameter. Now the question when I first learned AngularJS is, okay, so who passes in that scope parameter? And the answer is, it's injected automatically by AngularJS. So when a view requests and needs this brain behind the scenes, what will happen is the controller will get instantiated by AngularJS, and it will automatically pass a new scope, a new data container, that you can then put data into. Now in this example, you can see that we have a property called customers, and we're going to add that into the scope, and it just is an array, you can see, of some object literals here, some customer data. And then, of course, we might actually get this data remotely from maybe an AJAX call or WebSockets or whatever it is, but for now, we'll just leave it in the controller and kind of go from there. So that's how easy it is to actually get started with controllers. They're just functions. You have to have this scope. It must be named just like you see it there. And then we can tack on any properties we'd like, and you'll see later we can even tack on some methods or functions as well, because we're going to want to handle button clicks and mouse events and things like that.
Now it's important to note that this type of standalone function works great in AngularJS 1.2. However, starting with 1.3, they introduced a breaking change, and they made it so that you have to put these functions inside of something called a module. No big deal, because we're going to be covering modules in just the next section here. So I'm going to show a demo of this in action, but just keep in mind that if you're on 1.2, it'll work, but if you're on 1.3, due to this change they made, you're going to have to put this in something called a module, and we'll be talking a lot about modules momentarily here. So let's first jump into a demonstration, though, of how this standalone function works.